some slides. We'll show you 5 of the most common purposes of listening.
Yeah.
And then we're going to ask you to self-evaluate here. Which one you think is your superpower? Which of these 5 types of listening is what you're really good at, and you use it all the time, and you know that when you're in that mode, you are on, you've got it. And then the second slide we're going to show you in the polls after we explain these 5 just briefly is which one is your kryptonite, your weakness, the thing that hurts Superman. So the first one, of course, is recalling details. So Tatiana, when do you need to recall details? What are situations where that?
Instructions. I'll give you an example. This past weekend, we were at a family wedding, and I got called on to be on the buffet or the dinner setup committee because it was in a museum. So we had to go in and put the chairs in a certain way, the tablecloths. There was so much detail that I went through the instructions. I was listening intently, took so many notes, had sketches. So you don't want to mess that up. You don't want an upset bride. I was listening very intently. Absolutely.
It was a wedding weekend for both of us. I was at my own daughter's wedding, officiating at my daughter's wedding.
I missed because of our
Tatiana missed. Yes, that's all right. Family first. So that's recalling details. Be thinking, are you really good at that? Is that kind of your superpower when it comes to listening? Can you walk out of hearing instructions like Tatiana just did and really have it all down pat? Or is your superpower understanding the big picture? So now imagine that same scenario where Tatiana's like, I get the general idea. I'm supposed to put some chairs up somewhere and some food somewhere. That's the big idea. Then you would have had Bridezilla on your hands if you had told that, I think.
Absolutely.
When do you best listen for the big picture? What are some scenarios?
The big picture in this scenario too was what our niece did really well. She said, we have a museum space and we're using both parts of the hall. One side is going to need to be cleared for a dance floor. So immediately I knew what the purpose of this was. I could kind of envision the guests coming in as she described it. So I personally need to know, and this is good if you're going to be a good direction giver, to may say the reason that we're doing the sort of the big picture, talk about the forest before you get into the details and the trees, because some people need that to be engaged and to be drawn in. So the big picture is where you would sort of step us back and not worry as much about the details and think of the why of something is happening.
Right. And I think our listener who said, I need to up my game, my listening game in strategy meetings. This is your purpose. Understanding that big strategy is by default, big picture. Now, if they're starting to work through some of the implementation of a strategic direction, you might be getting into the recalling details. But I think that's one of the mistakes that we can make, is being so far into the details that we miss stepping back and saying, you know what, right now, this is about the big picture. And that makes the listening go a little awry.
And if I may add, many of us are detailed people, and we immediately start asking detailed questions instead of just letting the big picture come out and be specific. And we don't want to get distracted by that. So how we listen is also, we need to, as you start to think, what's my superpower and what's my weakness?
Yeah. I remember, Tatiana, you'll remember this too. Our school went through a branding campaign a few years ago, the university where she and I teach, the Kelley School of Business, specifically within that university. And when the marketing team came in to explain to all of the faculty, so this is a big meeting, hundreds of faculty members are there, and they're explaining the big picture. But you could tell the detail-oriented folks started asking, what date are we going to do X? What's going to be, what kind of logo is going to be on the book bags? And you could just, other people were so frustrated by that need for detail because it was so premature. We were still very much at the big picture stage. That's the second one. The third strategy, and I love this skeptical baby face, because evaluating the content is that third one. And it's interesting because you mentioned, Tatiana, that empathy takes a lot of energy and it requires this sort of emotional connection. And I think there's a lot of time and energy spent. I teach listening empathetically, so I certainly understand that that's an important skill. And we're always talking then about listening without judgment, and then boom, here we are saying some days, you know what? You need to listen with judgment. You need to be an evaluative mindset.
Yeah.
So what are the contexts? I know there are a lot of times when we're telling people stop the judging. When should we be saying start the judging?
I guess when decisions need to be made. I mean, think about all the decisions we had to make based on the information that we had during COVID, you know, sending your kid to school, not sending. An announcement comes out, you have to listen to that, you know, teacher parent meeting that is had and make a decision based on the information that you have. I can say, based on some situations, this may not be as specific, or you're deciding which way, who to follow. You know, you've got directions coming in two places and you have to support one versus another. You're being pitched, or you have to decide. Or on the side in the business school, I guess we hear a lot of judging business competitions. You do have to decide one or the other, and you really intently have to listen to content. This is when I'm a judge in a competition, I have a hard time sometimes being distracted by really good delivery of a team, but I see that the argument had Swiss cheese holes all over it. If I listen for the content, it was not there. So I need to know myself and know where to be focused. So listening for content is, I would say, decision making and times where you do have to wear that hat.
In your personal life, anytime, or professional life, anytime someone's trying to sell you something. A friend of mine showed up the other day with a little bag of caramel popcorn and said, I don't know if I should say who the nonprofit was, but it was the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts got him. A cute little Boy Scout knocked on the door, and he spent $25 on this little bag of popcorn. And I said, what happened to you? And I think it was just a great example of not evaluating the content. That bag was not worth, and you know, but instead sort of this empathetic listening got the best of him. And maybe it was a great decision to support a nonprofit or a kid in the neighborhood, whatever, but not evaluating content for sure.
When we're getting pitched things on social media, anytime, I'm sick and tired of my Instagram feed because it's all these pitches for different products and things. And at times I bought the non-scratch pads for the cats on the couch, or I'm doing a terrible job looking what the price, and it's just so easy. But the people selling us this are assuming we're not evaluating content. We're just going by the pitch. Yeah.
Agreed. This one was the one you mentioned, this idea of attuning to subtle cues.
Yes.
Really zooming in on those nonverbals. And I think you do such a good job of this. In fact, one of the reasons I love tag teaming with Tatiana is we can come out of a meeting and I will have the big picture down. I'm like, here is where this is heading. And she'll say, did you notice that John thought this about that? And I'm like, he never said that. She goes, oh no, but I was watching him. You are so good at noticing those. How have you trained your brain to sort of attune? What are you noticing?
I back to getting distracted by visual cues. I think I get used to kind of looking around. I caught the family wedding, back to that this weekend, a family member that got very emotional and was upset, and nobody else saw it. And I was attuned to it. I don't know what it was specifically, but I was able to bring it up and it was fine. But again, I don't know. Maybe I come from a different culture, and in Greece, a lot of the nonverbals are exaggerated even more. There's just a lot that's being said without words. So I would say I've been trained with a lot of that, so I can read through the lines in a way. But again, some of that goes to waste in a different culture where I haven't been exposed this much, and I can't read some of the subtle cues. I may miss them, like you said. I'm not sure. It's just something that's a little bit more intuitive for me.
Sam had written that very question. How do I get better at understanding these nonverbals?
Yeah.
And I think some of our tips for other learners have been things like practice reading the room. It's just second nature to Tatiana, but Sam, you and I may need to make it an actual practice. So I've caught myself on meetings that I'm going into. I make a personal note to myself on the meeting that says, notice nonverbals. And that little reminder, then when I walk out of the meeting, I ask myself, can I tell how each person in the room was reacting to certain items on the agenda? And if I can't even tell you that Tatiana was in the room, much let alone that how she felt on a certain agenda item, then that's a good reminder to me, a heads up to me that I wasn't reading the room. I wasn't taking that time to practice reading the room.
Sam, this is terribly difficult in virtual meetings. And then you add cultural differences on top of that. It's impossible. Where in a way you need to have seen probably the person interact in another setting or spend a little time with them so you can actually read them a little better. It becomes very, very challenging as we say that. By the way, by the end, I shouldn't give it away, but we are going to give you some good resources for working on some of your bigger weaknesses that you may have. And Sam, that includes that question.
Well, and Sam, I'll tell you what's on, spoiler alert, but one of the tips on that tip sheet is to watch your television with the volume turned down. And so you're forced to just see the nonverbals. And then as you're watching those nonverbals, you try to figure out, what's the storyline? What are the power dynamics? What are the relational dynamics? Who feels what? And then watch it again with the volume on and see how well that you did. There's also a facial expressions quiz put together by Berkeley. And if you just type facial expressions quiz, I think you'll find it. And just practicing with that quiz as a way of training yourself to start noticing some of the very fine and subtle facial expression cues that communicate different emotions could be really helpful.
You know, we should ask our friend Ray, who ran hundreds of focus groups. Isn't that what the researchers do behind the two-way mirror in a focus group? They're looking at how people are reacting and what they're saying. And it's easier to do if you step away versus having to be a participant, because then you would be awkwardly looking at everyone and taking notes.
But that might solve two problems. We said some of us are talking too much and we need to listen more. So if we're stepping back just a smidgen to quit talking, maybe we would attune a little bit more. I love it.
Absolutely.
So attuning to not subtle cues. And then that fifth behavior, and I think, Jay, this speaks to your question a little bit about you try to imagine their situation so much that you almost get lost in it. And that is this idea of listening with empathy. So Tatiana, any thoughts on listening empathetically?
I got myself into a sticky situation over the week where I made a comment on social media, on LinkedIn, about I met the Greek prime minister and made a comment saying they've done a really good job in the last 3 years. I didn't realize, and I took that part of my comment because I was making a statement on how I felt about the work that this administration did. I had so many negative comments. You can check them out if you want. My students were talking about them today. And a lot of it comes from, I don't live in that country, and I don't live and I don't walk in the shoes of the day-to-day challenges that people in that country may have. And it took a lot. I mean, initially my first reaction was, oh my gosh, really, seriously? Of course I had to talk it out. I didn't bother you, Brenda, because you were in wedding land as well. But I really had to process it through. And then I stopped and said, I shouldn't have done this in the first place. It's my fault. I shouldn't have made this statement. I can see that from that perspective and the points that these people are making in their comments, they have a point, and I need to honor that. And I need to not start and pick a fight and understand that there are different viewpoints, especially when it comes to politics.
Yeah.